concerns all of us. We're, as Aristotle pointed out long ago, we're political animals. We live in aggregates that demand a type of cooperation. And when things break down, they can get very ugly. And I think people tend to forget how fragile political institutions are. States can fail. Things do break down, and we have a history of an immense amount of suffering because of political breakdowns. So I think engaging, to some degree, we have to be politically engaged. I think the people that founded this country, with all their faults, had a lot of really spot-on ideas. But one of them, and the only private institution mentioned in the Constitution, is the press, because they really understood that a well-informed population was absolutely necessary for a republic to work. And that if you had people that were not well informed, then you're in trouble. And one of the, I think, really interesting aspects about that early period is their op-ed articles are now considered classic literature. So, you know, people study these things now at the university level. And a lot of people, a lot of average Americans don't even have access to something like the Federalist Papers, because they don't have the language skills to get into complex compound sentences anymore. So I think we're, you know, overall, I think our society is in a lot of trouble right now, and there's a lot of crises. It's not like I don't know enough about history to know that this is not something new. We've been through many crises before, but I think there's certain aspects now. Mass control is one of them. I think people don't realize how massively controlled people's thoughts are in this country. The people that watch the same programs, and those programs are controlled by a very small group of people that have, a lot of them have agendas. Some of them are business agendas, and some of them are political agendas. And probably one of the best antidotes for that is the traditional study of rhetoric. And I'll just end with one little anecdote. My grandmother, great-grandmother, who studied rhetoric in a high school in Wisconsin, I actually inherited her rhetoric book by Bain. It's called Bain's Rhetoric. And there's a chapter on the emotions. And on the section on fear, and remember, these are high school students in America. So in the section on fear, it said that politicians will always use fear to create a type of docility in the population, because when people panic, they tend to lose their critical thinking skills. And the book says generally they want to take away your civil liberties with the use of fear. But I mean, first of all, the Commission on Human Rights to me was, you know, I see it as, if you're invited to the table. I have a teacher, Sheikh Abdul Bey, who always says an empty chair is not a strategy. If you're invited to the table, it's always good to. Muslims often complain about how we're never heard and our voices aren't heard. And then when you're actually invited to the table where your voice can be heard, then a lot of Muslims will condemn you for being at the table. So it's one of those catch-22 situations in our community. It's unfortunate, but it is what it is. In terms of what's happening now, this is unprecedented. Even in 1918, they did not do the type of quarantine that we're seeing. So this is the first time, I think, in human history. Apparently 65% of the global population is now under house arrest, technically. I mean, fortunately, in this country, we're still allowed to go out and exercise and do things outside. So if you keep your social distancing. But in some places, and I've talked to friends in different countries right now, it's much more severe. And so I think the danger is clear and present, personally, that governments tend to really enjoy the type of power that comes in situations like this. And we have, I think our founders were very concerned about the importance of being vigilant, which is why we have the Second Amendment. I mean, it was actually because they were worried about government encroachment. And if we know history well enough, we know that governments tend to overstep. And in fact, a book that I teach on liberty, there's a chapter on there that Mill talks about the relationship where personal freedom ends and government authority begins. That is a very, very difficult gray area in human history. And for the last 200 and some odd years, we in America have, not all of us obviously, but many people in America have enjoyed a great deal of liberty. And so I think a lot of Americans right now are feeling they're concerned, and I understand those concerns. On the other hand, we have a situation that you have epidemiologists that are explaining the importance of these mandates, and so it becomes, I think, a very difficult area. And I don't really have any absolute answer, but I've been asked about people like these guys, give me liberty or give me COVID-19, the Michigan people with the guns and everything. And, there's something in me that actually appreciates that libertarian spirit that I think "Don't tread on me" was one of the slogans of the American Revolution. So I get that, where that's coming from. And Ibn Khaldun says it's actually a very important quality, because he says when people lose the ability to defend themselves in a society, then tyranny is quick to follow. So I understand those concerns. One of the most fundamental important aspects of religion is the ecclesia, the songhai, the minyan, the jama'ah. Every religion has this understanding of coming together, but we also have the Anchorite tradition. We also have the idea of really kind of retreating and going into the self, the sannyasi in Hinduism, where you really need to depart from the world in order to get a different perspective. And so I think this is an incredible opportunity. Like Reverend Eugene said that he didn't know anybody was enjoying it. This is one of the best things that ever happened to me personally. Like I get the hardships, and it troubles me that people have those hardships. But for me personally, this has been an incredible time to do. I don't know. I mean, I'm an ambivert, and I know I have friends that are extroverts that are having a really hard time. Introverts tend to have an easier time in these type situations. So there are a lot of people, the more gregarious type of people, that need a lot of human interaction, but there are those of us who really enjoy communing with the dead. I mean, I spend a lot of time with dead people, and I love their company. They never talk back to me, which is interesting, but they challenge me constantly. So I definitely enjoy this time. It's been a wonderful time for me personally. I would add to that in our tradition, in the Muslim tradition, there is a tradition of what's called uzla, which is withdrawing from society. And the Prophet said towards the latter days, when you would see so much corruption in the greater society, he actually said, cling to your homes. And so one of the benefits is not seeing so much of what is troubling out there. And there are many degrees of this, obviously. A go-to one for many religious people, and I know this is to the consternation of a lot of secular people, is just the pornographic nature of popular culture. When feminists back in the 70s came out against all of the exploitation of the women in advertising, the advertisers said, oh, you're right, let's exploit the men equally as well. And so then we get the naked men on the billboards as well as the naked women. So those kind of aspects that are very corrosive to the human heart. I mean, I don't think people realize the impact. And one of the things about the deadly sin of lust, which I think is unfortunately, our country is in the grip in many ways of that sin. is one of the daughters of that sin, according to the scholastics, is hatred of God and hatred of things divine. And so there's a lot of immense animosity towards faith in the popular culture. And so the Benedict option, which is being put forward by some Catholics, and I mean, this is something the Amish have been doing for a very long time, of just literally saying, you know what, it's time to retreat. And so that's one option, and I wholeheartedly accept people that take that option. Our Prophet Muhammad said that the best people are the people that interact with people and are patient with the harm that comes to them from that. And so it's a higher way. You know, people think that the monastery is difficult. The monastery is really easy. And as somebody who's actually done something very similar to that, I know how much easier the monastery is to marriage and children, and as Zorba the Greek said, the full catastrophe. You know, that when you enter into the world is an immense struggle, and but it's also something that's it's through suffering that wisdom comes, as Aeschylus said. So it's just part of the human condition, and we grow with that. Serving is a really important aspect of our religions, and it's not serving the self, it's actually giving up the service of the self for the service of the other, which is very important. And then seeing the other as a brother. You know, an intriguing linguistic coincidence in Arabic and English is other. The word for other is in the word for brother, and in Arabic the word for brother is in the word for other, with some trepidation, some concern, because I think the online, while it's tempting, I think there's a real downside to online learning. I think and this gets back to the ecclesia, the coming together of groups. I mean, it's very important for students to be in an environment where they interact with mentors and teachers, and that's at the heart of what Zaytuna College is about. So we very much see this idea of elders and the importance of really mentoring young people, and a lot of that, it's necessary to have real physical proximity. So when you're online, it's very different. Even now, we would have a very different interaction if we were sitting in a room together than in disembodied images that we're seeing online. So I think I'm concerned about it. It's a difficult time. We've transitioned completely online so all of our students, with the exception of a few international students that could not go home, our students are now learning online. Some of them are fine with it, but other ones are having a difficult time. So I think that's natural. So these are challenges, but like I said, we're in uncharted waters. This is unprecedented times, and I think all of us are going to be grappling with this in the coming months, of how we best adjust and adapt to the circumstances that have been thrust upon us. And this is the nature of the world. I mean, the world will thrust upon you things that you just do not expect. And this is why God has made us an adaptable creature. For good and for ill, because the horrors that people can adapt to are very troubling. And the desensitization, I mean, our society has become so desensitized to violence. It's almost unbearable for those of us who are sensitive to it. For organizations to do these things is very important. I think for individuals, I recently read a really interesting chapter in a book by a famous Andalusian scholar who was talking about a plague that had afflicted Andalusia, and he talked about how there were a lot of people suffering, and he had a dream where he was with all his students, and they said, how is it that we're eating when people are suffering out there with the plague? And in his dream, he addressed the issue, and then he writes it in his book. But what he said was, what was important is that we can't alleviate all the problems of the world. But he said, everybody, if they only took one person And he said in his case, he took two people, he gave 2 loaves of bread every day to 2 families. And he said, if everybody did that, just take 1 or 2 people where they took responsibility for helping them, those who are able, obviously. He said that would solve the problems, which is not to deny the importance of organizations that are doing it on much larger numbers. But I think individually we can do this. We can really help families in need by just, it's not hard to do. And I think everybody should try to do that if they're able to. The Muslim community in the 90s, when I was very active publicly in the community, was extremely conservative. And but because of I don't really like the term, but for want of a better one, because of the kind of anti-Muslim sentiment, a lot of Muslims have been driven into the left. And so now you've really seen a major shift in our community. And also, I think conservatives will concur with me here that in some ways Islam has become the poster child religion of the left, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But the tenets of Islam are odious to most people on the left, especially the extreme left. So they really don't like Islam as a religion, but it becomes useful. And a lot of the alliances out there in that community are purely utilitarian. They're not based on any moral or ethical considerations. So I personally think that the Muslims have a lot in common with the concerns of conservative Christians, because we want to see societies that don't objectify women or men. We want to see societies where children are protected from, they're in the Garden of Eden for, 10 or 12 years, and we believe they should be left there. Like, they'll taste the fruit soon enough. So I think there's a lot of areas we're people very committed to marriage and the importance and the sanctity of marriage. Also, I mean, I wrote an article on the abortion issue, because the traditional Muslim stance on abortion is very strong, and unfortunately, there's a lot of modern Muslims that are pushing this idea somehow that abortion was permitted, but all of the early classical scholars who just saw it as a heinous crime against the gift of life. So in that, especially, I mean, late-term abortion, like, as Isaiah reminds us, that for those that call evil good and good evil, this is a complete inversion of reality. And so I think those areas are very important. I'm not particularly, I'm much more in a kind of Burkean view. I don't really consider modern conservatives to have a whole lot to do with real conservative principles and values. But I do believe that Islam is fundamentally a very conservative religion in conserving the best. It wants to conserve the best. And so I think there's a lot of areas where Muslims and traditional peoples in the United States can ally for the good. And I think that if Christians, if they had a better understanding, and somebody like Gary Wills is a good example. Gary Wills was a public intellectual, Pulitzer Prize winner. He wrote a brilliant book on Lincoln at Gettysburg. He was a classicist. I think a quite extraordinary man. But somebody asked him in a gathering after 9/11, you're a scholar of religion, is the Quran a crazy book? And he said, he felt ashamed that he had never read the Quran. And so he actually spent a year of his life studying the Quran and wrote a book as a Christian, what the Quran means and why it matters. It's a very important book. But I think he came to the realization that, that he was prejudiced. And I think there's a lot of Christians that have deep prejudice towards the Muslim faith, and they don't know it. And if you think ISIS is Islam, then Catholicism is pedophilia, And, you know, I mean, or the Ku Klux Klan evangelicals or Ku Klux Klan members. I mean, these kind of really characterizations of faith that had an immense impact on Christianity. And anybody that studies the history of Christian theology, that reads Aquinas or reads some of the great scholastics of the Middle Ages that were heavily influenced by Averroes and Avicenna and Farabi and Ghazali. And these are historical facts. So this idea somehow that a civilization that could build the Taj Mahal is a civilization of suicide bombers. I mean, that's just, I think that should smack in the face of anybody with a modicum of intelligence as something that really needs to be reassessed.